This is one of my very favorite times of the year when we welcome the new and returning fellows and they present their work to the UVA and broader Charlottesville community. It's always a wonderful day for me. When the late Armstead Robinson founded the Carter G. Woodson Institute in 1981, he began his tenure as director with a twofold mandate. One, to enhance the research and teaching of African American studies in the schools and departments of the University of Virginia, and two, to establish an African American Studies Research Center, which would make significant contributions to scholarship and learning at this major Southern institution. It was the first of Virginia's colleges and universities to establish an African American Studies program after years of agitation. And last year, or the year before, we celebrated becoming a department after all those years of agitation. Since its founding, the Woodson Institute has broadened its scope to include other major areas of operation, among them digital initiatives, largely through our sponsorship and support of research initiatives related to Charlottesville and the Commonwealth of Virginia, carried out by independent scholars and UVA faculty alike, through public outreach that comes in the form of our schedule of programs and forums designed to bring the work of the Woodson Institute into the public square, as it were. In fact, I'll interrupt myself to say on this coming Monday at 7, we will have one of our public outreach events in our longstanding series called Currents in Conversation. And this will feature Richard Morse of the Haitian band Ram, who will be in conversation about the current political situation in Haiti with Professors Robert Ptin and Marlene Dart. Finally, as I talk about our expanded areas of operation since the Woodson Institute was founded, I would include publications, and this comes through the Carter G. Woodson Institute's imprint, sponsored by the University Press of Virginia. This afternoon, of course, we focus on the internationally renowned fellowship program. Since its inception, the program has sponsored both pre- and post-doctoral fellowships from robust applicant pools. In addition to advancing the research goals of the Institute, the presence of these fellows has enriched the number and range of course offerings available within our undergraduate curriculum and soon to be our graduate certificate program. Further, the program has been instrumental in faculty recruitment and has been, over the years of its existence, one of the most successful and cost-effective means of advancing the critical work of building a diverse faculty at the University of Virginia. We are proud that at least 3 of our current faculty members, all appointed exclusively in our department, migrated from the fellowship program into the faculty. And they are Edwin Kwame Otu, off lecturing in Copenhagen, Talitha LaFloria, off lecturing somewhere, I know, and most recently, Tony Curtis Perry. Selected through an intense international competition, the Woodson Fellows are themselves a diverse group of young scholars from different disciplines in the humanities and social sciences who work on a wide array of topics in Africana studies, broadly speaking. Over the course of our 38-year history, the Institute has sponsored close to 250 fellows whose work has appeared in numerous books, articles, and all published by the foremost university press and academic journals. I like to, when people stop by spontaneously to pay us a visit, I always make sure people come to this room. And so I can show them but a fraction of the work that the Woodson Institute has subsidized over the years of its existence. If you've been in the hallway, you see other covers. If you've been in our conference room, you see other covers. We literally, our walls cannot literally contain all of the work that the Institute has subsidized over the years. Woodson alumni hold tenured and professional positions at such institutions as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Berkeley, University of California, San Diego, Vanderbilt, UCLA, Michigan, MIT, Fordham, Howard, Ohio State, LSU, University of Iowa, University of Delaware, Northwestern, University of Texas, Austin, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Tulane, Auburn, Vassar, Williams, Washington University in St. Louis, Smith, University of Houston, University of Toronto, Hamilton, Carleton, Bowdoin, Queens, Brown, and the College of William and Mary, and that's just a few. Many of them have earned national and international reputations, and their research has, in many cases, transformed the discourses of their respective fields. Many of you have heard me say, if you want to know where research is going in any field in the humanities and in the humanistic social sciences, find out who is at the Woodson Institute. That's neither exaggeration or hype, it's fact. Not only that, it seems that each year when we host Meet the Fellows, one or another in our current cohort or among our alumni has just received a major prize, a major award, a major fellowship. In the past, these have included the MacArthur Prize, 1, the Bancroft Prize, 4, the Harvard Society of Fellows, and on and on. In 1 year alone, every prize the African Studies Association awarded to a faculty member or a graduate student went to a current or former Woodson Fellow. Last year, Talitha LaFloria had just been awarded the coveted Carnegie Fellowship, and Tara Hunter won no fewer than 8 prizes for her book, Bound in Wedlock, last year. And just last week, at the annual meetings of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, founded by our namesake, Curta Woodson, the Association of Black Women Historians awarded former pre-doctoral fellow Lindsay Jones, now on a post-doctoral fellowship at Brown, the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Publication Prize for her article, Black Girls, State Violence, and the Limits of Jim Crow, Virginia, which she had workshopped in our bi-monthly Fellows Workshop. Ava Perkis was awarded that same prize the year before for her article, Fight Fat, Black Women's Aesthetics, Exercise, and Fat Stigma, 1900 to 1930s, also workshopped in our monthly workshop series. Of course, as I close, I have to say the significance of our fellows and the work they produce cannot be measured in prizes alone, but rather by the influence and transformative value of their work for scholarship and pedagogy alike, whether or not it receives a prize. The circle of Woodson Fellows and alums grows wider and wider with each passing year, and the group from whom you will now hear are joining very rich and very distinguished company. They too are advancing the research for which this fellowship program is internationally known. Please join me in welcoming our fellows. And they will speak in the order in which their names appear in the program. Angelica, I'm supposed to introduce Angelica Allen, who comes to us from the University of Texas at Austin. We typically have somebody in our cohort from the University of Texas at Austin. They're very competitive. We don't take kickbacks from the university.
Good afternoon, everyone. The name of my dissertation project is Blackness in the Philippine Imaginary. This is a critical ethnography which deals with the lived experiences of a community that are currently living in the Philippines. They are known as the Black Amerasians. So these are the children of African-American military men and Filipino women that were sort of left behind and are currently living in the Philippines. And my work is very much informed by my lived experiences. I am both a member of and a scholar to this population's experiences. And in this presentation, I'll begin with, I'll divide it into two. I'll begin with a brief background of how this community came to existence, and I'll end in talking about the broader implications of this project within the field of African diaspora studies. Beginning with a brief introduction of this community, the existence of Amerasians in the Philippines is a direct result of the legacy of the Spanish-American War of 1898, its political afterlife, and the ongoing U.S. military presence in the archipelago. Currently, estimated reports range from 50,000 to 250,000 first, second, and third generation of Amerasians presently living in the Philippines, making them not only one of the oldest, but also the largest Amerasian population in existence today. However, despite the size of this community, Filipino Amerasians remain one of the most unrecognized and under-researched communities to arise from the Philippines' neo-colonial relationship with the United States. In fact, my study is the first to focus on Black Filipino Amerasians in the Philippines today. One distinction between Filipino Amerasians and Amerasian populations in other Asian countries is that this community is excluded from the language of previous legislation which would have allowed for immigration and citizenship rights to the United States. Both the Amerasian Immigration Act of 1982 and the subsequent Amerasian Homecoming Act of 1987 acknowledged and gave immigration preferences to Amerasian populations in places like Vietnam, Korea, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. However, these bills excluded Amerasians in the Philippines, Taiwan, and Japan. From World War II until 1992, the United States maintained military presence in the Philippines. However, it is essential to note that the withdrawal of the U.S. military from the Philippines did not mean improved lives for those living near the military bases. One of the most enduring consequences of this history is the persistence of imported American racialist ideologies that shape ideas of belonging and difference for the Black Amerasian community. What makes this project timely is that currently the Philippines passed a law, or the United States, excuse me, a 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, which basically means that they are making a military comeback to the Philippines. Of course, as you might imagine, there's some mixed reactions to this news among the community. While some have voiced or believe that this military comeback will create more job opportunities for the long term, others are concerned that the number of Amerasians will continue to grow and the numbers that are abandoned by their American military fathers will increase in size. My research question for this dissertation is the following: how do Black Amerasians actively define their own identities and shape the ways in which the larger Filipino community perceives them? My aim is not simply to document the ways in which this community experiences discrimination, prejudice, and trauma. Rather, I am more interested in the ways in which this community continues to thrive in the face of anti-Blackness. In closing, I want to briefly discuss the larger implications of this project and respond to the question of how does a critical consideration of the experiences of Black Filipino Amerasians expand our understanding of African diaspora studies. So I see this project as one that contributes to multiple fields, which includes Asian American studies, anthropology, etc., as well as emerging subfields such as Afro-Asian studies and also Filipinx American studies. Black Amerasians experiences forces us to reconsider what we presently know about the African diaspora and the importance and presence of African descendants in the Pacific, which we often forget about. It suggests the need to devote more attention to geographical regions outside the purview of the transatlantic slave trade beyond what Michelle M. Wright calls a middle passage epistemology. And for US-born scholars, it suggests the need to study Black life outside of the United States and into understudied communities who may complicate monolithic understandings of Blackness while helping to illuminate the transnational dimensions of anti-Blackness, how it operates in a global scale, and how is it locally inflected in the Philippines. Ultimately, what we stand to gain is a fertile ground in the Pacific region from which to expand our knowledge about the African diaspora. Thank you. And next, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Ms. Dana Cypress from the University of Pennsylvania.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dana Cypress, and I am a first-year pre-doctoral fellow here in the Woodson Institute. My home institution is the University of Pennsylvania's English department. I want to begin by thanking everyone at the Woodson Institute for inviting me back to the university and also for welcoming me into this intellectual community. I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm equally appreciative of the opportunity to share a snapshot of my work with you all. My project, In the Time of Disaster, Representing Hurricane Katrina in African American Literature and Culture, examines Black representations of Hurricane Katrina in literature, jazz, and film. I came to this project in my first year of graduate study. After spending a semester immersed in the innovative contributions of African American poets and feeling genuinely overwhelmed by the dearth of beauty and brilliance that these poets had already given us in the new millennium, I was challenged to write a term paper that would reflect, quote, the aesthetic, discursive, or rhetorical aspects of contemporary African American poetry. And although I was intimidated by this prompt, thankfully my notes offered up a hint of direction in the form of a recurring name, Hurricane Katrina, as a suggestion for further inquiry. I noticed that nearly every poet who had published work after August of 2005 had what I was starting to call a Katrina poem. Taking this singular observation as my point of departure for my paper, I asked myself what seemed like only a slightly more manageable question. What about Hurricane Katrina compelled these poets to write, to respond, to represent the storm in its aftermath in their work? And what might their representations, musings, questions, and slant poetic entries into an international conversation about environmental disaster with its apocalyptic optics and catastrophic proportions tell us that we didn't already know or see or hear and comprehend about the storm? These are the questions that animated that work and my dissertation project. My project returns to, or you might say arrives at, Hurricane Katrina with all of its significations through the lens of post-Katrina African American literary and cultural production. This project examines the ways in which African American writers and artists redraw the scalar dimensions of time and space to radically expand and revise our cultural memory of the storm. I argue that Black writers and artists adapt and disrupt and revise the temporal and spatial constraints of disaster across a variety of genres to render Hurricane Katrina as an ongoing process rather than a singular event. Their work elucidates the ways in which the storm and its aftermath are intimately connected to the limited gains of the civil rights movement, the war on drugs, the nascent years of the war on terror, and the future of Black life and death in the United States. I argue that two significant challenges to our cultural memory of Hurricane Katrina as a weather event emerge in the work of writers and artists such as Jessamine Ward, Kiese Lehman, Natasha Trethewey, Nikki Finney, Patricia Smith, Spike Lee, Matt Johnson, Terrence Blanchard, and Christian Atunde Adjua, among others. The first is a challenge to the authority of linear progressive timekeeping that enables historical silences and deliberate misreadings of Black life in relation to the storm. Across these texts, the time of the storm's landing along the Gulf Coast is abstracted through metafictive time travels, and it's stalled by distinctly Southern coming-of-age stories. It's cycled through its predecessors, Camille and Betsy, and compounded by the devastating losses that precede even its arrival. These temporal disruptions expand our field of vision to evaluate Hurricane Katrina in a series of longer, simultaneous historical processes that provide context for the hurricane's aftermath. These temporal disruptions respond to spectacularized visions that constituted the 24-hour news cycle with a mandate to account for Black life before and beyond the moment of spectacular violence, suffering, and loss. The second challenge to cultural memory that emerges out of this archive is the propensity for post-Katrina fiction and memoirs to present a deliberate spatial reorientation through their geographical pivot from New Orleans, which is the site of much of the media attention during Hurricane Katrina's immediate aftermath, to the Mississippi Gulf Coast. This geographical pivot is critical because it allows Black novelists and writers to explicitly connect Hurricane Katrina to the long civil rights movement and Hurricane Camille, which occurred during the tenuous beginning of desegregation in Mississippi. These texts demand that the limited gains of the civil rights movement and the policies that capped economic opportunity in the South for African Americans are given a hearing when we turn a critical eye to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. The project navigates these texts with their attendant temporal elasticity and spatial oscillations to arrive at a post-Katrina eco-poetics that marks the relationship between environmental racism, geopolitics, and the color line in the 21st century. Thank you so much. Please join me in welcoming my colleague Amanda Gibson from the College of William and Mary.
Thank you, Dana. And thank you to the Woodson for giving me this incredible opportunity. So my research is on credit arrangements in antebellum Virginia. Specifically on African Americans as borrowers and lenders. And I'm interested in understanding the evolution of the banking system within a system of racial capitalism. So I first became interested in the topic when I was in economic education and community development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And we were looking at modern day credit arrangements that were considered outside of mainstream. So we were looking at things like car loans, car title loans, payday lenders. We were looking at subprime mortgages. And these sort of credit arrangements became interesting because on one hand, they are very exploitive of borrowers, and they are undertaken, they're encouraged by very predatory lenders. But on the other hand, they seem to have some kind of social value. So for example, during the mortgage crisis, which was blamed on subprime lending, subprime loans were also in part responsible for making homeowners of record numbers of Black women for the first time. And I think that even the term subprime is problematic and also telling of the industry and the way that it's evolved over time. What is it about Black women that is subprime to banks? And it's because of centuries of white supremacy. And so I'm interested in understanding how that system evolved, how lending evolved within racial capitalism. So, for example, there were banks in antebellum Virginia before the Civil War, but they typically were not the commercial banks that we're familiar with today. So I'm looking at relationships of lending, who's borrowing, who's lending, and they are typically not within an institution, so they are between people. So my work so what I have found in my work is that these relationships show things like enslavement through debt, They show the importance of lending within the African American community to build wealth within that community. All of these things were happening even before emancipation, even before financial institutions as we know them had developed in the South and in Virginia particularly. So most histories of money and banking focus on the post-emancipation period after 1865. My work is attempting to find I see an earlier origin for some of these things, because racial capitalism starts centuries earlier than banking institutions started. And so my goal is to shift that conversation to think about how things like race and enslavement were integral to borrowing and lending even before banking, that banking institutions, when they came along, were grafted onto that system that was already in place. So, thank you. Next up is Dalali Kumavi from Northwestern University.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dalali Kumavie, and I'm a second-year pre-doctoral fellow. So I'm one of the old dogs. I come from the English department at Northwestern. So before I begin, I really want to thank Professor McDowell, Debbie Best, Randy Swift for everything they do to make our stay here comfortable, productive, and generative. It's a really good space to get our work done, and we appreciate everything that the Woodson does for us. So I'm still going to begin thinking a little bit about some of the latter parts of my projects, whereas last year I focused really deeply on my thinking about air and airplanes. This year I want to think more specifically about airports and where that project has taken me so far. So in the late 1990s, Ghanaian photographer Philip Kwame Apaje took a series of studio photographs with models interacting with painted backgrounds of airports and airplanes. In a photograph entitled "Come on Board," a young Ghanaian woman acts as though she's about to step onto the stairs leading to a Ghana Airways airplane. In another, a young man stands in front of the stairs leading into or out of an airplane with a white t-shirt with the word Hermes and a pair of sunglasses hanging from the neck of his shirt. It seems he is newly arrived. His neck is slightly tilted to the left, as though he's listening to the sounds of flights taking off and landing around him. Apaje's models, held in mid-action, capture both the aspirations of air travel as well as its potential failure and inertia. His images encapsulate aspirations of global travel in a place where such travel comes at significant cost. The airport, as the mediating site of these desires, is in Apaje's pictures relegated to the periphery and is represented as a series of distant windows in the background. You can see in the corners there. Its distancing from these caricatures or parodies of air travel reinforces its centrality in the making real of these dreams. Thus, the airport symbolizes the terrains of power through which these idealized dreams of global travel, with its attendant hope of transnational citizenship and cosmopolitanism, must first transgress. So my project is titled Dreams of Flight, Literary Mappings of Black Geographies Through Air, Airplane, and Airport. It examines the intersection of aviation with race and modernity through reading African and African diasporic literature from the 20th and 21st centuries. It extends what I see as the vital locus of African and Black global mobility, which have in critical and artistic discourse been the sea, ocean, water, and ship, to the air, airplane, and airport, to reveal how slavery, colonialism, and its technologies intersect with and haunt modernity and its technologies of travel. I ask in my project, for whom is the air, airplane, and airport merely a necessity of global travel? And for whom is this a reminder of the uneven and unequal structures of global power? The African philosopher Michael Eze observes that the fact of bearing, quote, a paperized identity in the form of a passport from the United States or even New Zealand means one has access to about 80% of the world, while bearing a Ghanaian or Nigerian passport means that one is forced to undergo and pay for visa procedures, prove that one has financial resources to undertake these travels, and avail oneself to exacerbated procedures such as interrogation, checks, and sometimes even deportations upon arrival. As Chandra Biomil puts it in her book, Empire in the Air, there are certain traces that are hard to ignore once they are sensed. The feeling that airline travel and racial oppression go together is one of them. In my work, I sense that there is a reason why the global citizen or the cosmopolitan, as a free-floating subject or an unhinged citizen, never has to deal with the ethical conditions of their freedom and the unfreedom of others. Thank you. Let me close this first. I'll introduce our next speaker. So our next speaker is Pablo Orzo. He comes to us from the African and African Diasporic Studies program at the University of Texas in Austin.
All right, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Delali, so much for introducing me. I'm also incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be at the Woodson Institute. I'm also one of the older pre-docs, right? So it's my second year, and I've been really grateful to be in the company of new colleagues and old colleagues. So my dissertation project is titled Queering Garifuna, the Diasporic Politics of Black Indigeneity in New York City. It's an ethnographic and archival study of Garifuna New Yorkers of Central American descent, particularly looking at how gender and sexuality shapes the negotiations, the performances, and articulations of Blackness, indigeneity, and Latinidad. My dissertation actually opens up with a pioneering essay in the reader, the Afro-Latino reader, History and Culture in the United States by Vierka Cecilia Oy. She's, quote, "When I'm challenged or questioned about my identity, I respond by saying that Black people exist in Central America. Some are descendants of enslaved peoples, some are not. Some speak Spanish, some do not. Some are Catholic, some are Rastas, some are Garveyites. Some are immersed in infused identities that include Native, Asian, and African nations. And when these Black people come to the United States, they come to be Black people from Central America, negotiating among invisibilities. In Queering Garifuna, I deeply understand that in the United States, the invocation of Central America conjures a set of racial and political imaginaries that centers mestizos, indigenous cultures, revolutionary movements, civil wars, and US occupation. That at times, I argue, eclipse a discussion of race and racism in the region and its diaspora. In Central America, race and racism is obscured by the ghost of mestizaje as an imagined racial mixture, birthing a mythical racial sameness bounded by nationalism. As you can see to my left, here you have a more recent kind of resistance to the monolithic national subject of Honduranness, right? This is the first time the nation state of Honduras literally recognizes on a legal document the presence of Black people in the nation state of Honduras. And on the, I guess also on my left side, here you have the resistance of Garifuna folks actually speaking back to the implications of a nation state who just recently realized their presence, but also the misnaming of who they are, right? Within Central American mestizaje, Blackness is relegated, alienated, and ascribed to the Caribbean coast, erasing centuries of Black folks in the interior and Pacific coast. So by ascribing blackness and black people to Central America's Caribbean coast, mestizaje constructs its imaginary in opposition to and in negation of blackness. So the geography of Central America allows for the nation to say black people are coming from elsewhere. They haven't been present before the development of the Republic. I actually begin in Central America's Caribbean coast because that deeply shapes the way Garifuna New Yorkers negotiate their black indigeneity within the larger black landscape of New York City. So right now where I am in the dissertation, I'm looking at gender and sexuality as an analytic to deeply understand what is this negotiation, what is the performance, but more in particular, I'm actually trying to queer the performance, right? So there's something inherently queering about the performance of Garifuna-ness in Brooklyn, in Grand Concourse, South Bronx, right? So to deeply understand not only the rejection of Afro-Latinidad, right? So deeply understand this is a moment where Afro-Latinidad is very fashionable. This is a moment where people are deeply understanding that there are Spanish-speaking black people, right? And this is a community who are coming from Spanish-speaking nation states who are rejecting that identity, right? Which speaks larger to the, not only the notion of Garifuna-ness that stems from St. Vincent, right? And that traveled throughout the diaspora to Central America and to the United States, but it also speaks to this idea that Afro-Latinidad is a failed project, right? In a failed project of including blackness as an addendum rather than understanding blackness to be fundamentally always already present in Latinidad. Thank you so much. I would like to introduce my second year pre-doc fellow colleague, Sean Reed, from the Department of Anthropology at Syracuse University.
Okay, I'm an archaeologist. I have to show you some stuff. My name is Sean Reed. I'm a PhD candidate at Syracuse University and a second-year fellow here in the Woodson Institute. So my dissertation is titled "Continuity, Transformations, and Ruptures in the Forests of Gold." So I'm a landscape archaeologist, and I work in southern Ghana, primarily in forests. Reading landscapes as artifacts of deep history and historical ecology is a productive yet immensely challenging approach in African archaeology. My dissertation attempts to bridge this gap through an examination of transformations in settlement patterns, socio-political complexity, trade, technological change, and agricultural developments in southern Ghana's coastal and forested regions over the past 2,000 years. In doing so, I challenge prevalent narratives about the simplicity of West African societies during the pre-Atlantic and demonstrate the socio-political complexity of inhabitants in the first and early second millennium AD. Utilizing archaeological survey, excavation, and multispectral satellite imagery analysis, my research examines how such societal changes were inscribed in the land and vegetation. This landscape is replete with archaeological features such as sacred groves, earthworks, abandoned settlement sites, artifact scatters, and bedrock grinding slicks that speak to a complex history long before the Atlantic trade opened. My contribution is critical to both African studies and African archaeology, considering the dearth of knowledge regarding pre-Atlantic material culture. It is extremely timely considering the ongoing destruction of archaeological sites in this region due to illicit gold mining, logging, and rapid development. Without this research, our ability to interpret the deep and vital history of this anthropic landscape is limited. Furthermore, while much of the current archaeological work in southern Ghana focuses on the Atlantic period, it provides detailed knowledge of the forts, the castles, the slave trade, the plantations. My research sheds light on the more long-term historical dynamics. And I'm revealing myself as something of an analyste, a Fernand Braudel devotee, to best understand and contextualize changes wrought in African societies as they were progressively entangled in the Atlantic economy after the 15th century. There are many unknowns about Ghana's pre-Atlantic past that are addressed in my research. For example, how does archaeology inform our understanding of pre-Atlantic African lifeways? How can settlement patterns be characterized in this region over the past 2,000 years? And why did they undergo such drastic shifts in the pre-Atlantic? When did major pre-Atlantic technological achievements such as iron smelting originate in this region? What is the purpose of the long grinding grooves and bedrock outcrops? I found these all over the place while surveying. How can these traces inform our understanding of pre-Atlantic technology and economy? How can a new understanding of the pre-Atlantic reconfigure our understanding of African socio-political developments during the Atlantic? At a broader level, one of the questions that indirectly frames my work concerns the idea of the impact of the Atlantic trade on West Africa. In other words, how can we interpret the impact of the Atlantic trade on West African societies, given how little we know about most of these societies before the 15th century? And so I spent a year surveying, and this, what you're looking at here, these are pre-Atlantic ceramics, and these are all over the place. The landscape is widely populated. These are some of these grinding slicks. And the argument, one of the arguments I make in my dissertation is that these are a product, a result of making these, which are stone axes, ground stone axes. And I connect it to another argument about agriculture, which I'm currently in a dispute with my advisor about. He disagrees, but I'm going to fight him to the end. And this is a trench I dug through an iron smelting site. So at this point, I will pass it on to my esteemed colleague, Halimat Samotan from Columbia University.
Thank you everyone for coming, and I'd also like to thank Mr. McDowell, Debbie, Randy, the faculty for allowing me to be part of the Woodson Institute, and also for my to my fellow cohort. I also thank you for the opportunity to be part of this intellectual community. So I am a second-year pre-doctoral fellow at the Woodson Institute. My own institution is Columbia University. My dissertation is entitled "In the Wider Interests of Nigeria as a Whole, Lagos and the Making of Federal Nigeria, 1941 to 1976. My dissertation looks at how working class and elite residents shaped the transformation of Lagos from the colonial capital to the post-colonial capital of Nigeria. It engages how urban dwellers negotiated the planning of Lagos during Nigeria's transition into political independence and military rule. My dissertation draws on a wild range of sources, from the oral interviews that I conducted in Nigeria, archival materials such as newspapers, petitions, and novels, to show the struggles among city residents to rebuild Lagos. Even though several scholars have focused on the roles of politicians and urban planners in constructing modernist buildings after independence, there are few studies that interrogate working class residents' opinions or campaigns towards urban transformation. My research recovers the intellectual ideas and contribution of working class people by documenting the landlords, tenants, and women traders campaigns for and against three policies: rent control, slum clearance, and municipal governance. One of the examples that I used to demonstrate how working class people shaped the building of Lagos is an evaluation of the debates and implementations of the slum clearance in central Lagos in the 1950s and 60s. So before the state displaced more than 20,000 residents in central Lagos, this particular project incited so much debate in the newspaper. Some Nigerian newspaper editors and their readers, they supported the slum clearance because they believed that this was necessary for making Lagos into, quote, a worthy capital city, end of quote. The landlords and tenants of central Lagos, on the other hand, protested and worked to amend the slum clearance agenda, or a land grabbing project as they called it. And one of the opponents' letters in the newspaper revealed the intricacies of the intellectual contribution as well as the campaign of working people towards shaping Lagos. So this writer, his name is V.A. Oni, and he's a tenant who lived in Lagos. And he writes to the editor of one of the famous newspapers in Lagos, and this is what he says in his letter. Quote, in regard to the slum parent scheme, I beg to point out that what we need most at present is plenty of food for every individual. It is true that we want our town, the capital of Nigeria, to be developed to a first-class city in order to match with other capitals in the world. But we must not forget the old saying, first thing first, end of quote. Oni's words exemplify the common criticism of urban planning projects that neglected socioeconomic issues like food scarcity. At the same time, he wanted the state to pursue other plans that would change the space and image of Lagos. And one of his proposals was that the state should actually remove its own offices from Lagos Island to the mainland. And Oni believed that Lagos Island would be less congested and the residents of central Lagos would stay on their land. And his comments, like a lot of people who live in Lagos, were neglected by the states. But for me, one of the remarkable things that Oni's comments showed is the ways in which residents were envisioning a different future for Lagos. And at the same time, too, the ways in which the ideas were very similar. They had a similar vision for what they wanted Lagos to become with politicians and urban planners. But in the case of Oni, he disagreed with how the politicians and urban planners wanted to carry out this project. So in my dissertation broadly, using and the example of Oni, draws on the words of residents like Oni to show how the opinions of working class people in some cases overlaps with those of politicians and urban planners, and in other cases diverges from those of politicians. And I show that the building of Lagos was not solely dictated by the opposition between the elites and the working class, but it was shaped by the competition within and among both groups. And to conclude, as Lagos becomes this big mega city that it is today, I think one of the questions that a lot of people ask is, how did the city become this mega city? How did it become this post-colonial capital city? And my project offers an answer to this question by examining a very critical moment in the making of Nigeria, which is the period when Nigeria transitioned from colonial rule to independent. And most importantly, what I'm showing in my project is I'm thinking with the ways in which residents of the city are imagining and thinking about what Lagos could be. Whether or not the ideas are taken up by the politicians, or sometimes they are and sometimes they're not, but I think the most important thing is documenting this perspective, bringing them into scholarly discourses so that we can continue to think with and with the ideas that the residents of Lagos have always thought, how they've thought about the making of the building of their city. Thank you. Our next speaker is Tracy Stewart from the University of Virginia.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Tracy Mia Stewart, and I'm a second-year pre-doctoral fellow. My home institution is the University of Virginia's Department of Music. My sincere thanks to the Woodson Institute and to Dr. McDowell for making this experience and our community possible. My dissertation, Being Jamaican Maroon.
Oh, my goodness.
It's not that. Okay, me and technology, y'all. Okay. My dissertation, Being Jamaican Maroon, Music, Power, and the Persistence of Colonialist Encounters, foregrounds Jamaican Maroon music as a veritable historical archive and a spatially and temporally transcendent mode of communication. Maroon songs are historical and social texts that reveal truths about the moment at hand and offer possible paths into the future. Jamaican Maroons are the descendants of guerrilla fighters who actively resisted colonialist domination by skillfully and strategically weaponizing the rugged and treacherous terrain of the island's interior. In 1739, over 80 years of war came to an official end when Maroon and British leaders entered into treaties of peace. Jamaican Maroons use music and movement to recall and document these and other historic events. This music allows us to draw direct connections between colonialist histories and the social and economic and political realities and prospective futures of Jamaican Maroons today. Their songs allow them to speak when they might otherwise be silenced. Let's watch the following clip. That was a recording of the Accompong Town and Scots Hall Maroon communities singing Maroon Law and Maroon Dawo Law, two musical articulations that are closely related in several ways. The songs vary in lyrics and length, and to a certain extent, melodic content, but the overarching meaning remains the same. Both performances inform and remind listeners that Maroons have the right to live and be recognized as culturally and historically distinct nations with bounded lands. And to be clear, the treaties don't grant Maroons their distinction. They simply document it. Jamaican Maroon distinction is expressed through music's textual, melodic, percussive, and kinetic components, which form layers of meaning for listeners and performers. Another performance of Maroon Law in Accompong Town was my first true experience of Jamaican Maroon music. The drummers and singers performed songs that I had never truly heard until then because I hadn't seen them, and seeing has become an important part of my listening experience. The dancers' movements were sedate but electric in intentionality, as if propelled by the weighty momentum of their shared knowledge. The rhythms, voices, and footfalls bounced off of the ceiling and walls, making it impossible to disentangle one sound from the other. As I tried to focus my ears, the music and its byproducts intermingled with the sounds of frogs, roosters, and dogs just outside. I breathed it all in, along with the smell of burning trash and chicken and chips, and the feel of dissipating heat as the evening advanced. All of that was captured from the spaces in, between, and beyond that room. All of it was captured by me and in me. Through my acts of consumption, I became a part of that performance of Jamaican Maroonness, which gets directed outwards for the purpose of filling the appetites of strangers. While music serves the Jamaican Maroon community in a variety of ways, it can also be subverted by others to serve conflicting interests. Jamaican Maroons have long witnessed the state appropriate their ancestors' acts of rebellion for its own uses. This excerpt from Jamaica's 2018 Independence Day celebration provides a perfect example. Let's watch. Okay, that was very short. So this was, I'm using this because this is the state celebration. They have the Maroons there with their drums, but it's a soundtrack. And the dancers belong to a dance troupe, a national dance troupe in Jamaica. So the only presence of Jamaican Maroons are the bodies of the Maroons that are around the drums, and their music has been taken away from that. Excuse me. The Jamaican state extracts elements of Maroon cultural traditions as effects in performances of Jamaican nationhood. It revises Jamaica's national history by sanitizing the complicated historical and contemporary relationships between Jamaican Maroons and non-Maroon Jamaicans in order to produce a more palatable and homogeneous national image. My research explores the ways that Jamaican Maroons deploy music in response to a variety of challenges and threats. Like their ancestors who used guerrilla tactics against the British, present-day Maroons use their environments and the tools that they provide, cultural and otherwise, to ensure the community's present survival. Thank you. please join me in welcoming Claire Ptin, who earned her PhD from Duke University.
Before presenting my work this afternoon, I am actually going to present the work of my colleague, Nzinga Kendall, who was unable to join us. And she's prepared a short text and a film that she'd like to share with you. Let's get the film set up first before I start. All right, so these are my colleague, Dr. Kendall's work. This video essay offers an audio-visual version of my thinking and research on Sara Gomez, the Afro-Cuban filmmaker who was born in 1942 and died at the very young age of 31 in 1974. My overall research on Black women experimental filmmakers includes the thoroughly engaging Gomez. She's especially notable as the first Afro-Cuban woman to make films in revolutionary Cuba with the support of the Cuban Film Institute. Doing film analysis using videographic criticism in the form of video essays has become a crucial component of how I present my research. In this video, I think through the fraught love relationship between Yolanda and Mario, the main characters in Gomez's 1974 film De Cierta Manera, or One Way or Another. Using an interview with Tomas Gonzalez, who worked with Gomez on the film script, as well as clips from the film itself, I reflect on the complications of love relationships between characters, between collaborators, between artists and artwork. Thank you. So can we have a round of applause for Dr. Kendall? So since everyone else has cool visuals, let's see if I can improvise. Internet. Sorry, don't look. Spoiler alert. So, as my colleague Tracy Stewart said, my name is Claire Antone Ptin. I'm a post-doctoral fellow here at the Woodson Institute in my second year. And I would also like to thank everyone for coming out today. I would like to thank my colleagues at the Woodson Institute for their intellectual inspiration and friendship. And I'd like to thank Dr. McDowell, Debbie Best, and the rest of the Woodson crew who have made this place a wonderful place to work. The character of a disaster depends on when it begins. At 4:53 on the afternoon of January 12, 2010, a tectonic plate shifted near Port-au-Prince, Haiti. The ensuing earthquake lasted 45 seconds. Between 100,000 and 316,000 people died as buildings across the metropolitan region collapsed. Scholarly interpretations of the earthquake that have emerged in its aftermath tend to rely on one of two temporalities. In the first temporality, scientists, engineers, and architects treat the earthquake as a singular physical event clearly defined in time and space. They emphasize the specifics of seismic forces and the technical failures of design that led buildings to implode. The other temporality, favored by scholars of the humanities, addresses the earthquake as a physical manifestation of the violence, inequality, and precarity that Haiti has endured since the 18th century, when it was the epicenter of European colonialism and slavery. Disasters crack apart the epistemological divisions usually used to separate material and social realms. My scholarship uses conceptual tensions posed by the 2010 earthquake as a point of departure for a deep historical exploration of space, power, and politics in the modern Caribbean. Instead of accepting a disciplinary binary between the longue durée of centuries and 45 terrifying seconds, my work charts a middle temporality, the history of Port-au-Prince's construction. How did the city that collapsed come to be? And this here is a picture of Port-au-Prince from 1974. I did not take it. I attempt to answer, okay, so how did the city that collapsed come to be? This is the driving question of my work. I attempt to answer this question in my book project, tentatively titled, "And We Will Be Devoured: Construction, Destruction, and Dictatorship in Haiti." The book will illuminate the world of construction in Port-au-Prince in the 20th century, a world that linked together the city's built environment with the fraught local, national, and international contexts of its production. I analyze what architectural historian Howard Davis has called the culture of building, the composite system of materials, people, knowledge, institutions, and habits that govern the building process in a particular social or historical context. The strengths or weaknesses of those relationships I'm exploring may have shaped the physical integrity of the city. So, some general historical context about my work. Two major transformations indelibly marked Haiti in the second half of the 20th century. The first was explosive urban growth fueled by rural to urban migration, particularly in Port-au-Prince, the capital. The second was the consolidation of state power into the hands of the Duvalier regime, an autocratic black nationalist dictatorship that ruled Haiti between 1957 and 1986. My work brings these themes together for the first time. As Port-au-Prince grew, it became a theater where large-scale social and political upheaval were re-articulated through local struggles over urban space. I trace the creation, destruction, and management of abstract and material urban spaces, from airports and aquifers to the political economy of cement. These spaces generated profoundly politicized narratives about the city, its history, its shape, its logic, which in turn generated possibilities and limitations that influenced the kind of life men and women could live in that space. This project is based on my 2018 history dissertation at Duke University, which was called "The City and the State, Construction and the Politics of Dictatorship in Haiti." As a postdoctoral fellow here at the Woodson Institute, I'm beginning to transform that dissertation into a manuscript, which involves revising the dissertation chapters as well as composing new material. My scholarship is making important contributions across several fields. As the first urban history of Port-au-Prince after 1950, my work folds the Haitian experience into a larger Latin American historiography that is theorizing the built environment and challenging this conceptual division between the social and material realms. Within Haitian studies, its emphasis on new temporalities of disaster adds much needed historical context to contemporary discussions of the post-disaster recovery process. It's also the first history to take up the question of quotidian life under the Duvalier dictatorship. The paucity of empirical, archivally rooted historical scholarship on the dictatorship reflects the sense, widely held by Haitians and observers of Haitian life, that the era cannot be studied because it's not over. It ended too recently, the wounds are too fresh, its actors are still present on the national political scene. Consequently, mainstream discourses about this period advance either oversimplified narratives of struggle between perpetrators and resistors, or racist and sensationalized accounts of extreme public violence perpetrated by a black nationalist government against a passive and ignorant population. My research changes this. By exposing the seemingly apolitical world of construction and the built environment, I reveal how the regime governed through quotidian urban politics that depended on a diffuse network of actors operating on local, national, and international levels. Thank you. And it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Jermaine Scott, who comes to us from Northwestern University, where he was in the program of African and African American Studies.
All right, good afternoon, good evening. First, I want to thank the Carter G. Woodson Institute for organizing this event, specifically Ms. Debbie Best, Mr. Randy Swift, the student interns, Kiara and Jill, and of course, Professor McDowell, for fearlessly leading the Institute to its renowned status today. As previously mentioned, my name is Jermaine Scott, and I'm a first-year postdoctoral fellow and lecturer here at the Woodson. And I received my dissertation from the African American Studies Department at Northwestern University. Here at the Woodson, I'm working on my first book, tentatively titled Black Teamwork, Football and Black Politics in the African Diaspora, 1950 to 2008, which is an effort to think about blackness on a global scale and the political significance of football, or soccer, to black communities. Growing up playing soccer in the US, I was often confronted with its racial character, as I was one of a few black players on an otherwise all-white team. However, the first World Cup I vividly remember, which was France 1998, I realized that football in the US looked differently than how it looked elsewhere throughout the world. From the Netherlands to France to Colombia, black players dominated the game. However, they also faced similar acts of anti-black racism. Nearly 2 decades later, football racism persists. Indeed, black athletes have historically and more recently positioned themselves at the center of the conversation about race in sports, largely focused on the US context with the NFL, NBA, and WNBA athletes. And within the past year, black footballers in England, including Raheem Sterling and Eni Aluko, have expressed their concerns about the racism they experience both in men's and women's football. It is this lifetime confrontation with football as a significant cultural activity for black populations on the one hand, and a sinister site of racial governance and hierarchy on the other, that led me to this project and a set of key questions. How does modern football reproduce racial hierarchies? How do black athletes and administrators make football a space of black politics? What does the study of football contribute to our understanding of the African diaspora? How have black athletes identified and disidentified with hegemonic representations of black masculinity? And what is the significance of black sporting collectives rather than individual black athletes? So my methodology really consists of archival materials and a conceptual methodology. And in the archives, I visited archives in the US, in the Netherlands, in England, and in Switzerland to gather materials largely found in soccer journals. But what really drove my argument was the conceptual methodology. So I came up with 2 original concepts, namely the coloniality of sport and black teamwork. The coloniality of sport is a set of practices and logics of modern sport that establishes racial hierarchies of white superiority and black subordination. So what I'm essentially saying is that in order to understand modern sport as we know it, we have to understand that it is constituted by logics of coloniality. And in an antagonistic relationship to the coloniality of sport, we have black teamwork. which are the methods deployed by collectives of black footballers and administrators that revealed and challenged the coloniality of sport that constituted different governing bodies. So some of my main arguments is that the coloniality of football reveals the persistence of global anti-blackness that constitutes post-colonial nation states. Right? But also that men's football became a critical site of diasporic black politics in the second half of the 20th century, yet maintained hegemonic ideals of masculinity. So what I'm trying to suggest is that there's a discourse that says that we need to look at sports through a racial lens, or we need to look at race through a sporting lens. And the language of the lens is problematic to me because it suggests that sports itself is somehow a pure institution, right? That we are somehow finding, or we are somehow eradicating racist structures from the sport. What I'm trying to suggest is that sport itself is constituted by race and coloniality, right? So it's not a matter of infiltrating sports and kicking soccer out of, kicking racism out of soccer, right? This is one of the global anti-racist bodies in football. This idea of kicking racism out of football is counterintuitive to me, considering that football itself is constituted by race and racism. So some of my chapters is obviously a wide range. In chapter 1, I'm looking at the Confederation of African Football and essentially their boycott of the 1966 World Cup qualifying tournaments. At the time, FIFA only allowed 16 teams to participate in the World Cup. One of those teams was reserved for the African and the Asian continent. So one space for both continents. Okay, so obviously the Confederation of African Football was not having that. They were established in 1957 in this context of African decolonization efforts, and they're fighting for essentially a space in FIFA. And so I talked about how FIFA represents the coloniality of football, and the Confederation of African Football represents the decoloniality of football. In chapter 2, I look at Howard University in the 1970s, where they essentially win the NCAA championship in soccer in 1971. Following that, the NCAA strips them of their championship because of eligibility reasons. What's important to note is that the Howard University soccer team was comprised of players from the Caribbean and Africa. And so the NCAA found this diasporic makeup of the team as a point of ineligibility. At the same time, white universities also had international students. So there's something about the blackness of that international makeup that challenged what is the Americanization and the whitening of soccer during the 1960s. So at this time, the US and the soccer authorities in the US are trying to Americanize the game. They're trying to make soccer an American sport, right? And they're doing this through racially coded language, right? So they're saying that soccer is the sport of the family, of the suburban family, right? This is during the 1960s in the wake of kind of the suburbanization efforts, right, that's going on throughout the country. So what does it mean for a black school, Howard University, a historically black college, to win the NCAA championship, right? Kind of challenge that project of Americanization. In chapter 3, I traveled to Brazil. My work travels to Brazil and looks at the Corinthians football team in Sao Paulo, where in the 1980s, under military dictatorship, they create a formation called the Corinthians Democracy. And it's essentially an effort to transform the team into a democratic formation that gives everybody on the team, from the players to the staff, to the coaches, to the masseuse, to whoever, a vote, right? And so we're all kind of voting on the future of the club. This is a radical formation, again, in the context of military dictatorship. Particularly in this narrative, I'm looking at a couple of Afro-Brazilian footballers who are not only interested in democratizing the club, but relating it to the Afro-Brazilian politics at the time. Okay. In my final chapter of the dissertation, I'm looking at the Netherlands and the Black Dutch players on the Netherlands of Surinamese descent. And this is essentially the moment where Surinamese Dutch footballers are challenging this idea of Dutch multiculturalism in the 1990s, particularly through football. And then in the larger book project that I'm currently working on here, I want to look at post-apartheid South Africa and the network of queer Black South African women footballers that have to essentially create their own space. This is what I'm thinking through toward the fusion of Black teamwork, a Black teamwork that is completely disconnected from the structures of the nation state in response to their violent exclusion. And then some of my interventions to close up. I'm really intervening in sports studies and African diaspora studies by incorporating critical theory to better conceptualize the coloniality of modern sport as a structure of racial power and hierarchy. Accordingly, I intervene in diaspora and cultural studies by centering football as a critical site of Black politics that revealed a global singularity of anti-Blackness and anti-queerness that persisted in the reconstitution of post-colonial nation states. I bring together sites that are seemingly disarticulated, and in the case of the Netherlands, largely understudied, to underscore the centrality of football to diasporic Blackness. Thank you so much. And next, last but not least, I would love to introduce Brian Smithson, Dr. Brian Smithson, who received his PhD from the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Duke University.
Thank you, Jermaine. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. I am a little intimidated having to go after my entire group of colleagues in the last position. So rather than talking immediately, I'm going to show you a video clip. What you're going to see here is the place is Benin. So we're in West Africa. The language being spoken here is Yoruba. And the movie is called Ikoko Atura. This is the trailer for it, which means the jar of sacred bliss in English. All right, so the reason I wanted to show this is, I'm going to try and get it to pause at a better position here. So this video here really captures, of course it's not going to start where I went. No, we do not. So the reason I wanted to bring this up is because it gets to the heart of a lot of what my project is really about. Here we've got this trailer that raises questions about this word collaboration, this beautiful word that was in there. Brian Ayokunle Smithson, in collaboration with Kapadi Benin / Kobe. This kind of speaks to the methods that I really wanted to get at when I was creating this project. I'm an artist by training, and that means that when I was making that conversion into anthropology, I knew I wanted to do work that would let me really get involved and participate in what I was looking at. And I knew that there was this enormous West African film industry, mostly located in Nigeria, you may have heard known as Nollywood. But there was also this very small-scale local film industry going on in Benin by Yoruba-speaking people living there. And that was really where I wanted to focus my efforts here. And I was able to get involved. I was able to act in movies. I was able to join some apprentices and do some training in camera work and editing. And then by the end of my field work, I realized that the majority of the people, sort of the main interlocutors and the best friends that I had made over 18 months were themselves producers of movies. They were the ones who were fronting the cash and creating these films. And they told me, they said, hey, if you really want to understand this stuff from start to finish, you need to produce a film yourself. And so that was what you saw here was the trailer for Ikokuatura, which was the film that I produced alongside these other filmmakers. Basically had a little extra money left over from my grant and said, here y'all go, y'all make something, I will help out how I can. And that's really the point where the research took off. It gave me this backstage pass to what was going on from every step of the way in the production of a film. For one thing, I wanted to know, for example, why is there such an emphasis in these Beninese Yoruba films on indigenous religion, especially when most of the people would tell you that they were Christian or they are Muslim. Hardly anybody will say, oh, I practice indigenous religion. But then they do. It's just not their main identity. So I wanted to know, why were they making these movies about these Yoruba spirits when in fact they say they're Christian or they're Muslim? Why? Well, you can kind of tell from this trailer. It's a film about how indigenous religion requires a certain religious coexistence among people who consider themselves Christians and Muslims as part of a much deeper commitment to indigenous spirits. So in making this movie, I also wanted to understand how is it that media production might be a site for culture and religious clash, but also consensus building among people who have different religious traditions. The Beninese producers that I was working with were struggling to articulate their place in the world when this is a small group of people. The Yoruba are a very small minority in Benin, in a small country, in a part of the world that most people don't really think about most of the time, unfortunately. So by focusing on production specifically, as opposed to looking more at finished films or doing a more sort of film studies analytical analysis of these movies, I wanted to see these debates happening on the ground and then relate them to debates in anthropology, African and African diaspora studies, and religious studies about how there are, what is it, these places that are marginalized by the rich world, how is it that they still are able to influence the transnational conversations about race, about inequality, and about the role of highly localized religions in a globalized world. So when I was on these movie sets in these studios, I saw these, for example, Christians and Muslims get into insult fights they were comic. They were intended to sort of belittle one another in the service of lifting up their commonalities, which was their devotion to indigenous spirits. I was able to see in the translation of this film how there was a debate over the translation of the word Orisha, which usually means God or divinity, but they were like, do we call this thing a fetish? Do we call this thing an idol? So seeing these ways that, the ways that African religions have been talked about in the West are influencing the ways people are thinking about them on the continent. And finally, I was able to see how actors and producers of these small-scale films become local celebrities in their communities, thereby gaining the renown that they need to become the champions of indigenous religion for their communities. Then finally, the question that came up again and again was why anybody was doing this. Nobody's making money on these movies. These are not films that people are doing to become rich. So part of the reason I had to sort of think about the economy behind these things. And really, it's an economy of mutual recognition and respect. It's about acknowledging one another, acknowledging one's fellow practitioner of religion, and making sure that everybody is staying relevant and staying legible to one another. So the book project it's derived from my dissertation. It's called Economies of Praise, Making Movies Religious in Benin. And it's a pleasure to be here at the Woodson Institute to be able to do that conversion work and sort of rethink the project in new ways with the help of my colleagues here at the Woodson Institute and everybody else here at the broader UVA community. So I wanted to thank Professor McDowell and everybody else for making that possible. Thank you.